Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 27th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film and TV history. I'm your podcast host, Anna Bogutska, and in this episode, you're going to get a mixtape of recommendations. As I was recording this series, I asked every one of my wonderful, smart, gorgeous, hyper-talented contributors to recommend a movie or a TV show about a serial killer or mass murderer. There was some debate over the nomenclature that they considered underseen or underrated in some way, and that I hadn't covered in this series already. The episode you're about to hear are these recommendations that I've been receiving throughout the months that I've been making this serial killer series. I'm also going to take this episode as an opportunity to recommend some films and TV shows that I really wanted to cover, but for one reason or another just couldn't. Some of these films perhaps I'll cover in future series of the podcast, others might pop up on the Patreon, which you can go and support if you're so inclined. I hope you enjoy this almost rants/recommendation mix and discover some new movies to fuck up your day. Feel free to reach out to me politely about what films I missed out on this series by emailing me on hello@thefinalgirls. And as always, if you enjoy this episode, this series, or this podcast as a whole, do take 30 seconds out of your day, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts. I love reading them, even the mean ones. Not that there's any mean ones, because all of my listeners are wonderful. There will be one more episode in this series before I bury the serial killers forever, or for a few months until I get another craving for Hannibal. You can find me online, lurking in the shadows and making lists on Letterboxd, on Twitter, and Instagram at AnnaBDemented. And if you want to, you can also get my new book on horror movies and feelings called Feeding the Monster, wherever you get your books. And with all that said, please enjoy this episode. First up is Pamela Hutchinson with a film recommendation from 1929, extremely on brand for her.
I'm going to go for a film that's quite well seen. I think a lot of people have seen this film. It's Pandora's Box from 1929, which is a film I'm very fond of, or I've spent a lot of time with.
Wrote a book about?
Yeah, I wrote a book about it, actually. And one of the things I was wary about when I started to write the book about it was the Jack the Ripper element. I was like, I don't know about serial killers. That's not me. I'm a nice girl. And I got a bit into Ripperology, which is such a great name for the field. I actually think this was before The Five came out. So Jack the Ripper pops up in silent film. He's in Waxworks. I mean, The Lodger is a great film that's based on the story. It was based on Jack the Ripper. I can see why you haven't got The Lodger in your list. Anyone who's seen the film will know why. But I think that we got to stand up for Pandora's Box, which doesn't get talked about in terms of serial killer films. And why? Because it was doing something that we're still catching up with. It's not a film about a serial killer. It's a film about the serial killer's victim. It gives us several acts of Lulu living her life, being mistreated and being treated terribly, following her own always innocent desires. Yeah, she does accidentally help to kill a man, but...
Who doesn't?
I mean, it is his fault. I can't even begin to tell you how complicated it is, but it's definitely not her fault. And she does, she gets punished for that. And she ends up in the hands of Jack the Ripper. And everything that could happen to almost save her has fallen away. She has no protection. She is a woman who is a sex worker in the streets of London. And although she is kind and innocent, she had the people who should be looking after her have turned their back on her because they'd rather go and eat Christmas pudding in the warm than look after her or care about what happens to her. And one of them is just too sad and ill to do so. And so she meets Jack the Ripper, and even though she is beautiful and they have this kind of spark, he cannot resist the impulse when he sees the knife. And he sees the beautiful woman. And this was a kind of theme that Palps was really interested in. He'd made a film called Secrets of a Soul about a man who has kind of like knife obsessions. It's a really interesting depiction of Jack the Ripper when he turns up, because he's quite sympathetic, because we see his vulnerability, his loneliness, his isolation first. We see the Salvation Army say, "Oh, can we help you?" And he says, "No, I can't be helped." And we see his shadow fall across the poster that says, "Watch out, women, there is a killer around. You must stay in well-lit areas." Again, we're just like in M, we're warning the victims rather than anything else. But yeah, we see that sort of classic trope of the killer's shadow falling across the poster, warning people of his presence. So yeah, I think that, you if you're thinking about Jack the Ripper in any other context, you have to look at Pandora's Box, which is a great film, which I've now entirely ruined the ending of.
I'm happy about that. It doesn't make me want to watch it any less.
Oh, did you think it was just about boxes? No, because a lot of people do you know that?
Next up are author Heather Parry and film journalist Katie Rife with 2 recommendations from the 1970s.
So I think this is underseen by like my generation and younger. It was quite well known in its time, but it's Female Prisoner Scorpion.
Yes.
The whole series, but specifically Jailhouse 41, which is from the early 70s, I think 71 or 72. And a Meiko Kaji movie, and I love her. I love her in the early 70s specifically. She was amazing. Mm-hmm. The Stray Cat Rock series was just fantastic. But yeah, Female Prisoner Scorpion, Jailhouse 41 is about these women who are in this prison. And it does have some quite brutal stuff. Like, it has some sexual violence, but it's so well used, I think. And it's psychedelic and it's weird, and she's just amazing, and you could look at her all day. I wish more people had seen it so I could talk about them with it.
There's a film, it's in the Criterion Collection, but you don't see it talked about too much. It's called Vengeance is Mine by Shohei Imamura. That is a serial killer film that it's along these same bleak lines as this one. It was from 1979, but in tone, it's a lot more similar to like the kind of like gritty 90s. I think it was very much ahead of its time.
What is it about? I've never heard of it.
It is another film that is based on it is another fictionalized biopic of a real serial killer, but a Japanese one.
And scholar Stacey Abbott picks out a rom-com featuring Jack the Ripper.
I was thinking a lot about this, and the film that comes to mind isn't a serial killer film. It's the film Time After Time with Nicholas Meyer from 1979, which is a great. I'm taking from the sound of your voice that you know it. That's great. I love this film, and for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's a film about sort of a cat and mouse game between H.G. Wells and Jack the Ripper. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say it's not a typical serial killer film is that it's a time travel film. Yep. It's about the two of them traveling in time from the Victorian era to the 70s. And I love this film so much because I think it's got some stellar performances from Malcolm McDowell and David Warner and Mary Steenburgen. So really fantastic performances. But from thinking about the killer, it's just the idea of David Warner as this killer, Jack the Ripper, the most iconic serial killer that everyone knows, finds himself in 1970s America and suddenly feels like he fits in and says, I belong here. You're out of place. And there's something about that idea of relocating him there at a period where obviously you have post-Vietnam and, it's a violent world and serial killers are on the rise. He suddenly fits in. And I think it's a really wonderfully unsettling and scary story about this kind of murderer and how they see themselves. It's the idea that suddenly he says, in London in the 1890s, I was a monster. Here, I'm normal. I'm nothing compared to what we see around us all the time here. And I love that story. I love that idea. It's so disturbing.
I love that suggestion. I had not thought about it at all in years and for this series. So that's such a beautiful suggestion.
Excellent. No, that was great because I'm a huge fan. And also David Warner is really good in the role. He is just... He looks great in 1970s America.
Well, I always think about it as a Malcolm McDowell film because I'm a big fan of him. And obviously, him and Mary Steenburgen used to be married. They met in this film. And I love the idea of seeing them fall in love on the screen almost through the making of this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why the film is this wonderful hybrid because it is fundamentally like a time travel love story, and it is their love story. And that is, and Malcolm McDowell is wonderful as H.G. Wells as this kind of, he's the one who seems out of time, like out of his time. He's traveled into the future and doesn't fit in and feels lost and meets her and then finds this kind of connection. And then you've got Warner on the edges, on the periphery, being this kind of playing this cat and mouse game with him and him being very David Warner and suiting 1970s coolness. And suddenly, and there's something really disturbing about that. The fact that, he is, he balances out the romance and the beauty of the love story with the sort of disturbing 1970s, what's the world coming to kind of critique that the film is offering, which of course then justifies the kind of their return to the 1890s as this kind of, well, we're going to go back into the past and be safe there, as if that's so much better. But,
spoiler alert, it isn't.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Friend of the pod and Faculty of Horror co-host Alexandra West wants to recommend the one Hannibal Lecter movie that we did not cover in exhaustive depth.
I always have to go with, and it was the first thing that flashed into my mind as I saw this question, which is Michael Mann's Manhunter. I love this movie so much. Faculty of Horror just did an episode on it earlier this year, which was so much fun to get to talk about. I'm a big Michael Mann fan, and I love Brian Cox. I love everything about this movie pretty much. I love Tom Noonan. So you get like really 2 for 1. You've got the original cinematic interpretation of Hannibal Lecter by Brian Cox, who is my favorite Hannibal Lecter. I'm just going to say that right now. I know. This is very controversial. I know, it's super cool. I think every actor who's done it has put their own stamp on it, been incredible at it, added something to it. But when I go back to the one that really scares me, it's Brian Cox. I'm legitimately terrified of him in that film. And then, of course, Tom Noonan as Francis Dolarhyde, or the Red Dragon, is eerie, synthetic, unsettling, dark, and so disturbed. And I love it. I think it is so singular. It is so much about, the obsession of killers in the media and, the toll it takes on everyone. And I find it to be super entertaining, super engaging, and terrifying at the end.
We don't have enough time in the universe to discuss Brian Cox versus Mads Mikkelsen or Anthony Hopkins. A lot of my contributors picked serial killer movies from the 90s, which was really a peak era for serial killer films, starting with Sorka Nieline, who picked the other Brad Pitt serial killer movie that was not Seven.
One I would recommend, actually, we've mentioned in our podcast on 7, is in California, actually, with a K. It is, I think, one that was seen quite a lot on video in the early 1990s. May not necessarily have transferred too much to the Blu-ray world, but it is worth giving it a go. It's Brad Pitt, again, as a serial killer in this case, with David Duchovny, who's trying to write a book about serial killers. While it's definitely not a manual on how to write a book, it's definitely an interesting kind of idea of conflating the road movie and the serial killer film and trying to understand the drive of the serial killer. So it's kind of right in the middle of that sort of renaissance of the serial killer narrative in the around 1993. So it's worth giving it a go, I think. So that's California.
That and also Natural Born Killers, as well as the Juliette Lewis doubled bill.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, Juliette, exactly. Yeah. So the thing is, it's like a rock. Once you lift this kind of 90s cinema, it's everywhere, so trying to find the good from the, separate the chaff from the wheat is sometimes a bit tricky. But I think there's some real nice little gems back to that time.
Podcaster and New Zealander Maha Al-Badrawi wanted to talk about an obsessive friendship that turned murderous.
So the first one is Heavenly Creatures.
Yes,
Peter
love
Jackson film. Absolutely love this film. It does a really good job of capturing the kind of like obsession, the obsessive nature of friendships when you're a teenager. But it also does a good job of showing the weirdness and isolation of New Zealand, especially New Zealand back then in the 50s when it was even more isolated than when I lived there, which was in the 2000s. I love that film. I think it's worth a watch. It's completely manic, but it's so unique.
I love that film, especially the way that it really jumps from the imagination and the fictional shared world that the characters create for themselves, and that they kind of start believing is true and cannot separate what's real from what is their fantasy. And as well, kind of this line of, when people have read this movie in different ways, but it's both this intense friendship between two teenage girls and also potentially like a budding queer romance between them that might be one-sided or might be not. And what's your other one?
So New Zealand has this soap opera called Shorten Streets, and it's been running for 30 years, I think 35 years. It's our longest running soap opera. And back in 2007, a serial killer came to Ferndale. And this storyline gripped the entire nation for, I'm not kidding, a whole year. A whole year they had the serial killer story. 5 women on the show died. And not just like side characters, main characters died. And when it was revealed that it was Joey Henderson, the mild-mannered nurse, I swear to God, I watched it live. I heard a collective gasp from my living room window. Also, he has a really iconic death. He stands on top of the roof and he goes, "I am Joseph James Henderson, gone but never forgotten," and then jumps off the roof. And then Shortland Street, this is a pre-Watershed TV show, shows you his body on the ground with blood pouring out of his skull. And I just have never been prouder of my adopted home country than I was in that moment.
There is a new Nicole Kidman murder show on Netflix, but Christina Newland remembers one of the original ones from 1995.
One I've been thinking about a lot lately, though I guess I don't know how much I can say, it's under discussed now, but it's just had a Criterion release, is To Die For, the Nicole Kidman film, the Gus Van Sant. What a motion picture that is. It's sort of a little bit of Network and a little bit of May December and a little bit of Serial Mom, and it's the outfits are absolutely phenomenal.
Do you know, I love that film. I've never thought about it as a serial killer movie.
I guess really she only kills, she's a murderer, but I don't think she doesn't kill more than one person, does she?
I think she just kills her husband.
Yeah, it's just the one. But if I can get away with that, I'd love that film.
Speaking of peak serial killer media in the 90s, I want to shout out a Spanish film from 1996 called Thesis. It was a debut by Alejandro Amenabar, who then went on to direct the others. And this one is about a group of young adults, students in a Madrid university. I didn't go to that university, but I visited it a lot, and it was intensely creepy, mostly because of this film. It follows a journalism student called Angela who discovers a snuff tape and decides to investigate who's behind it along with her horror-obsessed buddy. Video essayist Izzy Custodio cheats the system by recommending not one but two movies, depending on whether one of them has enough murder or not.
Does it have to be like a horror, or can there just be murder in it?
Can be murder in it.
Okay. I want to recommend the movie Uptight, which is a 1968 thriller drama. It's based on an Irish novel that was then turned into a John Ford movie and then turned into a movie directed by Jules, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, Dessin. Okay, so it's an American drama film that essentially takes place between, like, right after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it's about a kind of like more militant inclined Black community and and also a community that like believes more in the Martin Luther King, like, we should, peacefully protest. And one of them kind of like rats out the other one. And so like the two of them kind of come together and trying to figure out like who ratted them out. And it kind of like devolves into this violent uprising, I guess. And it's like incredible. And I'm really obsessed with it. Yeah.
Amazing. I've never even heard of it. That's so good.
It's so good. I think it's on YouTube. I'm not even sure now that I'm thinking about it that there is a murder, but there's an informant. Should I just recommend a different one?
It's a murderless murder movie.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm like thinking about it because I'm like, there's so much violence in this movie that it has to have a murder in it. But now I'm like not sure and I'm scared. So I'm going to recommend a different one.
Okay, go for it.
But you should watch that though. It's so good. Okay. My recommendation is The Ceremony by Claude Chabrol.
Great one.
It's just an incredible film. And I think it touches on some of maybe the class issues that we were talking about earlier, where it's this very like beautiful, rich family. And this woman who goes to work for them is like, who works in the house and basically does service work for them. And a friend that she makes who's played by Isabelle Huppert, who lives in the town and is kind of odd, let's say, and how they kind of like react to the family, and eventually becomes very violent, and it's amazing.
You know that when Isabelle Huppert shows up and has an intense friendship, air quotes, with another woman,
chaotic.
Yeah, shit's gonna go down and it's not gonna be pretty.
Things are, going sour.
Writer and actor Isaura Barbara Brown picks another deeply unsettling film where a man goes about his day, which also includes a little bit of murder.
I saw this when I was probably too young. I think I was a teenager when I saw it. I think it was on TV. I don't know how I watched it, but I watched it. The Young Poisoner's Handbook, which is about Graham Young, who was also called the Teacup Killer, right? And he just was obsessed with poison, poisoned his parents, poisoned his colleagues, and just couldn't stop poisoning people. And just he couldn't stop it. He couldn't help himself. And there's one point where he's like working somewhere and he's just poisoning his colleagues. He's making them cups of tea. And it's the most British, like, if you imagine how much tea, like I go through, I don't know how many cups of tea a day. And I'm like, imagine if every time someone's just putting a little bit of poison in there. And they're so British that it couldn't be the tea. No one suspects a tea at any point for like quite a long time. But it's just this guy who's on the surface seems quite helpful. He's like, just going to go make everyone's tea. And he's just poisoning them. And not even to kill them in most cases, just to make them sick for a long time. Just wants to see what it does. And it's so quiet. And he's such a weird little quiet man in it. Like, and it's so understated that it really chilled me to my bone when I saw it. I was like, I didn't even know you could do this. I didn't know you could be the kind of like person who's like sometimes murdering people, but sometimes not, just because you want to see what happens again for no reason. You have a job and a life, and just every day you're like, just going to put some poison in the tea. And it's great. And I don't know that everyone talks about it enough. It's so weird and so British.
I love
and so
that.
Creepy.
I love that. I'm going to have to check that out. I have never even heard of this case or this film.
I can't believe this is all happening over cups of tea. Like, in this quiet, weird way. It's so unsettling.
Another film that I really wish I would have made room for in the series, and I definitely will cover at some point in the future or on the Patreon, is Kiyoshi Kurosawa's 1997 psychological horror Cure. This film is magnificent. I'm a big fan of Kurosawa's work. He's just had another film premiere at the Venice Film Festival. He's still making work. And this one follows a detective investigating a series of bizarre murders where everybody turns up with carvings on their body, but no killer is in sight. It's an incredible film. Absolutely came out around the time of the J-horror explosion, but preceded some of the more well-known, more supernatural films like Ring or The Grudge. Really regretting, even as I record this, that I didn't cover it on the series, so you can fully expect it to show up at some point in the near future in this podcast series. And frequent collaborator and friend of the pod, writer and podcaster Becky Dark absolutely destroys me by picking out the serial killer movie with the most sexual tension.
I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
I'm ready. Give it to me.
To speak about 1999's The Bone Collector.
Shut the fuck up, Becky Dark. I just rewatched it recently. Hit me.
Fuck off, seriously.
Yeah, seriously.
This film is so good. Honestly, directed by Philip Noyce. Yes. You've got Denzel Washington, Angelina Jolie, Queen fucking Latifah, for God's sake.
Peak cast, like so late 90s. It's that amazing, I feel like this is, I think about this film very much in the same cinematic universe as Saw. Like, it's kind of, it's Saw before Saw. And you've got Denzel Washington, who is he's a quadriplegic ex-homicide detective, and Angelina Jolie finds this body and has to kind of get it. She basically investigates it, and you've got Denzel Washington sort of talking into her ear from his bedroom as his body kind of decays. She's got cameras, and he's sort of zooming in so he can look at clues, and she's sort of young and green and out in the field. And then this is why I talk about it in the same sort of vein as Saw, because the kills in this film are so fucked up. There's one where somebody gets eaten by rats. Yes. There's one where there's the one with the steam where they've got the guy chained up in kind of this underground passage where it's like a ticking time bomb. Again, this idea of this ticking time bomb. The steam comes out and literally melts the flesh from his bones. I love this film so much, and I honestly think it's underseen, and I don't think enough people talk about The Bone Collector. I'm so glad you brought this film up. I was not expecting it. Also, we're not going to spoil it because it's well worth a watch. But the clues that are left for the detectives at the murder scenes are so over elaborate and so fucking petty. Oh my God, Jigsaw could never be this petty. And also, the other thing I love about this film, right, is the sexual tension between Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie, two of the objectively most beautiful human beings that have ever been put on screen, both at their peak beauty. You said it. Denzel Washington plays a quadriplegic. He can only move a finger. Mm-hmm. And the way Angelina's eye-fucking him the entire film, it's so screaming true. Disability rights. And I love it.
Yeah. Yes! And as well as the fucked up kills and all of the incredible sexual tension, it's got one of those moments that has just never ever left me, that literally every time I get in the back of a Taxi, I'm like, please don't lock the doors and make me have to unlock them, because the bit with the like sharp, like, it's so fucked up. I love it.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you brought this up. That's such a banger, Becky. Thank you so much.
Yes. Proud of myself.
Critic and friend of the pod, Layla Latif, picks out a film I think about often whenever I'm inclined to lend a helping hand to strangers.
So this is when I was like working in this field. So for all I know, this is a giant movie on the art house circuit, and I'm going to make myself look like a complete Philistine by saying that this is an unseen movie, but I absolutely adore the 2000 film Harry, He's Here to Help, which in French, it's a French film, but I believe it's Harry, un ami qui vous veut de bien. Harry, a friend who wishes you well, which is not as catchy in English. It's the direct translation. I mean, it's sinister, it's incredibly acted, and it's got that sort of like, you know, piece of so many of like my favorite slasher films where I wish I'd like seen that scene. I'm thinking of like the moment that like the two teenage boys in Scream discovered they both had like serial killer propensities, and it's darkly comic, it's very sinister, it's got a bit of the Michael Haneke vibe about it, but like the idea that like you could be the unrelenting psychopathic killer and be like, oh, and I've sort of met a fellow one of me, and just like not quite have pitched it right. It's kind of a comedy of manners as well, and I absolutely adore this. It feels very much born of the sort of era of Hitchcock in the way that it like structures thrills, scares, and, you know, and somehow has like moments of like comic relief. But
I love this film. Great pick. Also, it's one that really plays with the idea of not being able to place a foreign figure. Because the figure of Harry, the film set in France, Harry is played by Spanish actor Sergi Lopez, and he often plays villains. And he became well known for kind of leaving Spain and taking on a lot of kind of like foreign language films where he's playing either in French or in English. And there is this weird dynamic where everyone is able to place one another when you're speaking the same language. You know, this happens a lot in the UK where you can sort of categorize socially who someone is through how they speak, their manner. It's a lot more difficult to do that when someone is speaking a second language. You can't tell who they are. You can't classify them as easily. And I think his character as Harry is really slippery because of that, partly. Because he becomes this almost like foreign attraction for his French neighbors. They're too slow to realize who he really is.
We've got two really incredible female characters in this. Sort of our protagonist's wife, who's this sort of, you know, more, you know, overstretched mother, and then Harry himself, who kind of comes with, I suppose, like the hyper feminine trophy wife sort of figure. And like you see that the way that's power dynamic shifts, where it's a case of, you know, like the sort of mother, the mother feels lesser than, she feels dowdy, she feels a bit like, oh, okay, this is the object of people's attention, to people's desire, and then it shifts and you realize that that's also going to doom her to be the more fixated upon when it comes to violence.
Author Kirsty Logan brings us into the 2000s with a semi-forgotten Ryan Gosling serial killer flick.
So I don't know if this is necessarily a good film, but it's a film that I love and have seen many, many times, and that is Murder by Numbers. Sandra Bullock, right?
Michael Pitt, Ryan Gosling.
Yes, right? Yep. I have watched that film an embarrassing amount of time. I think I had it on VHS back in the day. I don't know if it's underrated or it's actually justly rated right where it is, but I've seen it before and I will watch it again.
It's such a blast from the past. It's a very sort of early 2000s version of the Leopold and Loeb story. Now, since I'm doing this episode sort of chronologically, I'm gonna recommend one of my own. This is a TV show that pretty much reinvented the serial killer for the small screen, and I was really desperate to cover it on the show, but couldn't find a way. It is, of course, Dexter, which ran for 8 seasons and has had several different spin-offs, including a recently announced one, and starred Michael C. Hall as a blood specialist working for the Miami Police Department. That's his day job, but his night job was a serial killer who had been inculcated with a staunch moral code by his dad. Dexter had ups and downs. It very much was in that early wave of really violent, transgressive TV. Its opening credits are incredible, really gnarly. It's an incredible central performance, one that's really defined Hall's career, even though he'd previously starred on a huge peak TV era show, 6 Feet Under, and it definitely lost its way towards the end. But if you're looking for a very enjoyable, very bingeable, slightly mad serial killer TV series, it's all recently landed on Netflix. You might know this director from such hits as Blade Runner 2047, Blade Runner 2040. You might know this director from the Dune movies, but Alexander Helenicholas remembers him from that one mass murderer movie he did in 2009.
Is mass murderer count?
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to split hairs. A film that I feel, it's by a well-known director, Denis Villeneuve. But an earlier film of his that I feel doesn't get the praise that it deserves is Polytechnic from 2009. Yes. And, when I talk about true crime films as a kind of monument or a testament, that film to me is the textbook case. That film stands as a monument. It's like seeing a statue, it's like seeing a sculpture that stands as a monument to an event, to a horrible event. It is a remarkable film. And I will give Denis Villeneuve infinite space to fuck up elsewhere in his career because he made Polytechnic. It's a film that's about the 1989 Polytechnic massacre in Montreal, often called the Montreal Massacre, which was an incel massacre. A young man went to the university. I think he goes into an engineering class and basically tells all the men to leave and shoots the women, basically just guns down the bulk of the women remaining. And his idea is that if they were women doing engineering, then they were feminists. It was very explicit about that. So this film tells the story of the actual event, but where it goes is somewhere so unlike where these kind of films go. And it really, to me, does stand as a monument to the lives lost in the Montreal Massacre. I think it's an extraordinary film. And I don't think any other films really ever come close to doing what Villeneuve did with Polytechnic. It's such a good film.
It is! Forget about Dune. Go watch Polytechnic. I'm going to do another cheeky recommendation. And of course, it has to be another Spanish film. I really considered pairing this with Desis, which I spoke about a minute ago. But I thought that maybe not that many people would have seen this film, but you should check it out. It's called, very simply, Cannibal, subtitled A Love Story. It's a sort of drama serial killer movie from 2013 by Manuel Martín Cuenca, and it stars one of Spain's greatest actors, Antonio de la Torre, as a cannibalistic tailor who is very introverted, but has a thing for eating people. But he's very demure about it. Podcaster and friend of the pod, Steph McKenna, resurrects a little discussed indie gem from 2016.
It's quite a hard question because I think you've covered so many great films already, and I don't know if you will cover this, but I recently rewatched I Am Not a Serial Killer.
Oh, yes.
I think is pretty underrated and underseen.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 2016 horror film directed by Billy O'Brien based on a novel. So another, love a literary adaptation about a teenager called John who lives in the Midwest with his mum, who has a funeral home which he lends a hand with, and he's a diagnosed sociopath, but he's developed this code to behave by so he doesn't commit any murders. He starts to track a series of sort of mysterious murders in his hometown that he wants to investigate. So you've got a potential killer hunting down an actual killer. And the image, we talk about visual language, the image of that pink embalming fluid from that movie has stayed with me since 2016. It is so visually striking. And I just think it's a great little film, actually. I think it's a blend of a few genres, part supernatural horror and sci-fi and thriller, bit of coming of age drama. And it's got a really wry sense of humour that sort of feels a bit reminiscent of Donnie Darko. Really like the performances, and the cinematography is great. It looks superb. It's has a sort of retro vibe, a bit sort of super dark times. So yeah, I went in pretty cold when I saw it originally, and I was quite surprised by the direction it went in, but in a pleasant way. So I would recommend anyone else who hasn't seen it kind of doing the same and not reading too much in advance and kind of going in to see it. I think it delivers on gore and humour over scares probably, but I don't think I've really seen anything quite like that since. So
we discussed several shows and films based on real life serial killers on this series and tried to do so delicately. Clarice Lockery, chief film critic of The Independent, friend of the pod, and Batman hater, picked out a film that we didn't get to cover, but that certainly is a rare example of how to portray real-life murderers with sensitivity.
Oh man, I was struggling to think of this. So this is a fairly recent movie, but I just find myself thinking about it a lot whenever we talk about the representation of real-life serial killers, because I think actually outside of David Fincher, Zodiac, it's very, very rarely done well. I don't know if you'd agree with that. I feel like I've seen so many just exploitative, kind of cheap movies. Totally. And I would say My Friend Dahmer, by Mark Meyers, who also wrote the screenplay and got the story from a graphic novel of the same name by John Backduff, who was friends with Jeffrey Dahmer when they were both teenagers, and essentially wrote this graphic novel to try and grapple with the question of, why didn't I spot this? And I think that's such a potent question, and that's such a kind of difficult question to ask, because to me, ultimately, the entire conversation around this, the end aim should be, how do we stop this from happening again? Because, I guess culturally we are in a place now where serial killers are quite rare. That sort of phenomenon has passed, but we have other situations now of extremely troubled people who turn to violence and are just create horror. And I think collectively we all just want to figure out the key of how do we intervene? And there isn't an easy answer to that. And I think My Friend Dahmer has a sort of self-critical, self-analytical aspect to it, of this guy, of John Backduff, looking back on his own memories and saying, gosh, yeah, there was some real red flags there, but at the same time, this is the complicated thing about, crime, murder, serial killers, is not every person with that psychological profile does the crime. And we as a society may never be able to answer perfectly, why someone does that. because, you know, I guess, have you seen it? Because it's
I have, yeah.
You know, it's kind of the Jeffrey Dahmer that you meet in the movie, like, he, like, is you know, he's things with dead animals, and is very, like, he's really neglected by his parents, which, you know, every psychologist will be like, well, that's the makings of a serial killer. But there's plenty of kids who are neglected by their parents and, like, collect dead animals and grow up fine and grow up into kind and gentle people. And I think that movie plays with that tension of, like, at the same time, we don't want to be assuming that every weird kid at high school is a potential killer, because that's incredibly messed up and often leads to, you know, marginalized people being persecuted for no reason. That's the whole reason this, like, satanic panic happened, for example, is people, like, you know, going crazy over just people who act slightly different. So sorry, I've gone on for a very long time now, but I think that's what I really appreciate about that movie, that I really don't think I've seen kind of before or after. It's incredibly rare to have a movie that is that honest with itself, I guess.
Totally. And also considering that it stars a very, a grown-up Disney star, Ross Lynch, who is very, you know, conventionally good-looking, it really avoids falling into the trap of making a serial killer hot, quote unquote. You know, it doesn't do what the Zac Efron version of Ted Bundy's story does, or what even Evan Peters' version of Dahmer, the TV series, does, which is trying to thirst after this serial killer. He's very, and I've not really seen him act since, really, in many things. He really did pull out this performance out of the bag and make him very, very troublesome from the start. And a lot of it has to do with the way that he just sort of moves around the world, the way that he is sort of performing weirdness while being extremely off-putting, almost innately, to everyone around him, including his own family.
Yeah, I found it, like, I guess, really realistic in the sense that, yeah, there is something kind of sad about him in a way that doesn't, you know, undermine any of the horrificness of his personality as well. But that's the thing, it plays between those tensions of going, God, he's had a sad childhood, God, he's really cruel. And you kind of ping pong between those two emotions for the entire movie. And then you don't really have a resolution for it, because there is no resolution. The movie ends with him he's about to commit his first murder. And you go, gosh, I guess we're never going to know what was that single trigger that, like, pushed that person from being, you know, a troubled teenager to being Jeffrey Dahmer, the serial killer.
Editor-in-chief of Dread Central and friend of the pod, Mary Beth McAndrews, talks about two movies, one of which we covered, and the other we actually covered in the teen horror series, but would have 100% fit in this one too.
Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. I know a lot of people haven't seen that one, and I think that is one, and also The Loved Ones, which I mentioned both in my episode, but absolutely highly recommend those two.
If you've ever wondered if maybe one of your parents is a secret murderer, then BJ Colangelo's recommendation is going to be one for you to discover. Another indie gem from the 2010s.
I am very interested in the movie The Clove Hitch Killer. It's 2018. It's a coming-of-age thriller by Duncan Skiles. I think it was his directorial debut. It is loosely based on the BTK killer, but I find the perspective to be very interesting because it is from the perspective of his teenage son discovering that his father is a serial killer. God, great. Which the son is played by Charlie Plummer, who is in one of my favorite movies of all time, Spontaneous. I think it is such an incredible performance of watching this boy realize that the man who raised him, the man that he's like looked up to his whole life, is not the man he's known, and trying to navigate those feelings, I think is just absolutely fascinating. And this movie kind of went underseen. It was pretty big when it came out, and I think 2018 was one of those movies that everybody on like film Twitter was talking about for like a month, and then it seems like no one has talked about it since then, which is a real shame because it's really fantastic. It also has Dylan McDermott. He is the father. Samantha Mathis, who I forever love. She's in it as well. But yeah, I think super underrated, really good. It's an IFC midnight film, so whichever streaming service usually has those films, depending on where you live in the world, it's probably there. Yeah, Clovage Killer.
Oh, I love that. I really seriously considered including this in the series, and then I had to make some cuts. So thank you for that. That's a great pick.
Happy to have contributed. Any chance I get to talk about why I think Charlie Plummer is like the most underrated young actor working today, I'm gonna take the opportunity.
And finally, not to bring the mood down or anything, but film critic Sabina Petkova and Freudian film analyst and podcaster Mary Wild pull out two of the most grueling serial killer films from recent years.
You know what? I think I could, even though I do not subscribe to it, I would never rewatch that film ever again. But I think it's important for it to be talked about, is The Golden Glove.
Oh, yes,
by
please.
Fatih Akin. Yeah, I remember when people were saying, yes, this film shouldn't exist, no one should see it, and effectively it did disappear. It didn't get almost any distribution deals, and I get why, because of the backlash in the topic. And yeah, I defend the existence of any film at any point, just because I don't want to be censoring. But when I saw this film, it was really an awful film to watch, as in an awful viewing experience. But I didn't find it self-serving. I thought it provokes a lot of very intriguing conversations about what do we show, what can be shown, and what's the purpose of showing things like that. And it's, of course, extremely violent towards women. And, of course, the real killer was extremely violent towards women. And the decision to make the film as ugly as possible and as horrific and crawling in your skin, I thought that was admirable. Because, yeah, it's not the charismatic serial killer that one can see in other films. It's quite the opposite. So, anyway, I think it fits well within the big framework of serial killer movies that it exists. As I said, I would never watch it again.
The one that I picked did very well in the film festival circuit quite recently in 2022, and that is Ali Abbasi's Holy Spider, based on the true story of a serial killer who targeted sex workers and killed 16 women from the year 2000 to 2001 in Iran.
It's a great film. I actually really oohed and awed whether to include it in the season or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's really good. That's a great pick.
So my parents are Iranian, and so it's always fascinating for me to watch a film in the Persian language. And I felt like, I don't know, it's so interesting to connect elements of Persian culture with the concept and notion of a serial killer, because it's a very conservative culture. And especially in the city where Holy Spider is filmed and where the story is based, Mashhad in Iran is a very religious city. It's extremely like holy, and people there are very devout. So the very notion that these brutal killings were taking place in this setting itself is extremely interesting. Of course, very tragic. So I like the true crime element of it. And I thought that the subject was very sensitively depicted in the film.
That is all for this almost rants / recommendation mixtape style episode. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you've been taking notes. There will be one more episode that will land in your feeds next week where I talk about serial killer movies. But other than that, this season is wrapping up. And if you've listened so far, thank you so much for staying with me. Thank you for listening.